Well, thank you for coming again, and thank you for waiting, because I did say that we'd be live streaming at 1, so I wanted to wait till around 1 o'clock for those people that are joining us online. I want to welcome you again to WPA today, and in this month of gratitude we also celebrate All Saints Day, which we did on Sunday, and the history of Westminster, and in that time period of planning for this, especially since we had no new heritage members this year. I was interfacing with Carolyn to find out why. She told me there was a beloved pastor that left in 1973, and there was some financial brouhaha going on in the Presbytery. And so maybe that's why people just didn't want to join a church at that point in time. Or those people have already passed on or moved away, who knows. But anyway, so we knew this year would be a little different, and Carolyn, instead of presenting to the whole very energetic group on Sunday, said she'd rather, not that we'll be less energetic, hopefully the conversation, but at least we don't have little ones running all over the place like we did on Sunday, which was great. When John and I joined this church, one of the reasons we joined was because it was intergenerational and wasn't targeted to one age group. Because early on, when we were first married, I read a book by Edith Schaefer called What is a Family? And she talks about the church as a family. And a family has all ages and has a diverse kinds of people. And that's what we love about Westminster. So our speaker today is Carolyn Morris, and I don't know if it's an official or unofficial title as Westminster historian. Unofficial. And most of you know her better than me, so that's all I'm going to say. She said the title of her talk today is Crossing the River, Westminster's Historical Journey. And I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn.
Thank you all for coming. I'm going to try to talk for like 35, 40 minutes and give some time at the end for some questions. And so we're just going to begin, and I'm not taking you right up to today because this is history. We're going to stop somewhere in the 1970s, and I'll tell you why, because it has a lot to do with our 3 core missions. And Jim has agreed to push the button to make the slides go forward. So if there's a problem, you don't keep your hands off of it till I tell you to move. So anyway, some of you have heard this before, and a lot of you have been raised in this church. You've been baptized in that very font. And I feel like I've been a member here 42 years, so there's so much I don't know, but I have a very inquisitive mind, so when I find something, I just keep going at it until I get an answer. And many answers I never have found, and that's very frustrating. So anyway, I'm going to just start with why is history important? And it reminds us of who we are, why we're still here, who made the sacrifices to keep us here, and have we learned from our mistakes? And have our early goals been achieved? Are we still setting goals? And also, it's really important to be accurate. So if you find, especially you people that have been here longer than me, if you find something that you know is inaccurate, let me know and I'll change it. Because that's how we get to accuracy, and I have found more inaccurate things during my research. So how did we get from that little rented chapel up on the top right-hand side in 1861 to our present location today, which of course is in the middle? Okay, James, thank you. So in order to figure out why we are here in this neighborhood today, we need to go back to figure out how did the Presbyterians get to Grand Rapids? And we go back to the 1830s, 1840s, and I found this in the Grand Rapids Library. It was sort of depicted that era, and so I put it up there. It's important to remember that Grand Rapids was still a frontier town. It was a fur trading center. It only had a population of 1,500 people. And of course, the streets, if there were any, were unpaved and not lit by anything, not even the gas lamps then. And it wouldn't be known until the Furniture City until 1876. So Presbyterians in 1836 decided that they wanted to establish a church, and they did with 36 members. And they named that church, of course, First Presbyterian of Grand Rapids. And at that time, the Congregationalists in Grand Rapids decided that they would worship them too. And I don't know why. Maybe they didn't have enough people to do their own churches, but they got together. Now, the very first year, they had a Presbyterian minister. But a year later, the research shows that a congregational pastor was then called. And Grand Rapids actually became a testing ground for this type of union at that point. So the Congregationalists and the Presbyterians were probably close on theology, but very different on governance. Congregationalists were used to self-governance, while the Presbyterians, of course, held with structure and governance with strict adherence to the Westminster Confession. By 1839, the First Presbyterian Church had more Congregationalists than they did Presbyterians. And so it officially became the First Congregational Church of Grand Rapids, and eventually that became Park Congregational. So by 1850, the city of Grand Rapids was incorporated and the population had started growing. So 1855, the population now is 2,600 people. And the Presbyterians said, okay, let's try again and start the First Presbyterian Church. And this time they called the Reverend Courtney Smith out of New York, and he was known for new church development, and he became their stated supply pastor. He had a Master of Arts from Middlebury College in Vermont and was licensed to preach in Troy, New York. And that church was established on the west side of the river. So this depicts a neighborhood in Grand Rapids in around the 1860s, and I just kind of wanted to have that picture up there to give you an idea of how we had progressed from that fur trading community now to what we have. So by 1861, Grand Rapids now had a population of 10,000 people. So in a 6 years' time, from 2,600 to 10,000, I thought was huge. And it was still pretty much a frontier town. It did have the beginnings of cobbled streets, and some of the streets were even lit by gas lights. And there was no public transportation yet in the neighborhoods surrounding, especially this area here. The sidewalks were planked, they were warped, very slippery in the winter, but the Presbyterians were now ready to cross the river. And why now? The United States, of course, was still recovering from the 1857 financial crisis, and they would not recover until after the Civil War. The Civil War had just begun 2 months earlier, so why start a church now? Well, the Presbytery saw the east side as the area, obviously, where the growth was developing. We now had, as I said before, 10,000 in population. Since First Pres was already established, though it was struggling financially, they still decided to go ahead and have a group cross the river. And Reverend Smith, who was the stated supply of First Pres, he was asked to take 25 members from First Pres who lived on this side of the river and to go ahead and start Westminster Presbyterian Church. Now, I would think those 25 people were eager to get across the river because they didn't have horses, they walked. You can imagine in the winter how difficult that was. And we had 2 Sunday services, one on a Wednesday, cold. So I think they probably were very happy to get over here and walk to a much closer church. So this is a picture of the Swedenborgen Church. Our first worship service was in a rented Swedenborgen church in July 1861. And this was on the corner of Division and Lyon. And it was not unusual for this church to rent out space to help with its own finances. So there were other denominations that would come in and rent the space for their services. I don't know the date on this, but I do know the courthouse is already there. So that puts that a little bit later. We would have already been out of that particular neighborhood. To plant any new church, it takes financial aid support, as we all know. And both First Presbyterian and Westminster received aid from what was called the Board of New Church Erections. The Presbyterian Church in 1861 had 2 branches of theology, New and Old School, they were called. And each was very eager to establish their theology in any new church that was developing. So both First Pres and Westminster were started as embracing New School theology. Now, this was a more liberal form of Presbyterianism, embracing revivalism, social justice issues, and encouraging missions in partnerships with other denominations. Old School was conservative, rejected revivalism, and called for strict Calvinistic adherence as outlined in the Westminster Standards. They felt social issues such as slavery were political and should stay out of churches. And cooperating with other denominations in missions was actually frowned upon. By 1863, Westminster requested aid for a third time, and the New School Theology branch said, nope, no more money. Well, at this time, who stood up and said, I'll give you money? That was the Old School branch. And so they gave the money that the church needed to go ahead. And thus they became, at that point, an Old School theology church until 1867, when the New and Old School theology merged. Now, I always thought, why in the world, if you start out with New School, why would you switch to Old School theology? And Dan Van Meers gave me a book from the library all about the Presbyterians in our area and the churches, and right in black and white, it told that story of how they had been denied the money, and therefore they went to Old School. So I thought, okay, follow the money. Next slide. So Reverend Smith, Courtney, left in 1865, and he was replaced by his nephew, Reverend Reuben Goodman, who graduated from Princeton in 1846. Now, the Goodmans would remain until 1872, and it was actually Reverend Goodman who grew the church. His daughter Julia, in her memoir of those early years, remembers her parents walking the ungraded streets in Grand Rapids and knocking on the doors and inviting neighbors to join them for worship. So by 1866, a larger church was needed, and Westminster's first church was dedicated March 10th, 1867, and it stood where Kendall School of Design now sits today. And Reverend Goodman's daughter, Julia, said it was a lovely little structure. And she went on and described the new church as being constructed of white brick and facing Division Avenue with a full basement underneath and a flight of steps leading up to the sanctuary. There was a choir loft above the entrance, a cabinet organ, a carpet on the aisle, and padding on the pews, but only if you furnished your own. Heat came from an open register in the aisle, light from a gas chandelier, and gas lamps along the walls, and the interior was all white, including the beams across the ceiling. Julia went on to say it was a happy and proud congregation that moved from their former building, the rented Swedenborgen Chapel, which she described as ugly and as dingy as a barn. The daughters also noted that their father, Reverend Goodman, was a good carpenter and performed much of the physical work in building the edifice. There's two slides I'm going to show here just to give you an idea of how Grand Rapids had progressed by the 1870s. And there's this one, and these are in different downtown areas, which were not too far, and you can show the other one too, which is more of a housing type of thing. So 1874 now, we've got a population of 26,000 people. And that whole area has been growing around it. And by 1875, the government purchased our church and all the property around it for a new post office and courthouse. And this is an artist's rendition of that. And we were somewhere in that block when that went up. And you know, I've often wondered how this congregation felt leaving this special little church house that they had built. After all, it was their home for 8 years. And amazing that they didn't just get it up, and they were absolutely willing to start over with another move and build another building. And I think that really says something about the character of those early forebears of ours. So this is actually the chapel that they built. We have no picture of all of that chapel sitting by itself as a structure. So I took a picture and I zeroed in on that so that you could see that was on this far end of the location in the lot. And we finally moved there to that current location in 1875. And the chapel and the sanctuary were designed by a local architect, D.S. Hopkins. The chapel was built to seat 300 members. The foundation for the sanctuary was laid at the same time, but it wasn't completed until 1885, till the funds were raised to complete it. And I have, and later on, if you want to, I have the architectural drawings of the chapel and then once the sanctuary. So we know what the whole floor plan was at the time this was put together by the architect. And it's just fascinating when you look at it. It shows where the pastor had his own water closet, where the women had to go all the way over to the other side. This is once the sanctuary. But anyway, it's a really great piece of history. Okay, the next one. Reverend Sanford Cobb, 1885, 1894. Now, near the completion of the sanctuary, Reverend Cobb arrived. Now, in between him and the other pastor, there were some stated supplies, and there was another pastor. But Reverend Cobb came in 1885, and he received his BA in 1858 from Yale and his theology degree from Princeton in 1862. So this is a picture of the completed sanctuary, which now has a chapel, the whole complex. I think, Dan, you had that picture maybe at yours because of this mystery house behind there, which I think I found something about that. We can talk later about it. Reverend Cobb started his ministry, I think, among a very fairly successful congregation. Okay. So I'm going to take a little time to keep this slide up now because this was our very first chancel, and you are sitting right now in the most historical part of this building. It was completed in 1885, and there's so much history in here, and you can't possibly do it all in one lecture. I mean, the windows, there's so many different things. But what you're looking at here was actually right there where the nativity window is now. So you had, if you want to look that way, that alcove had this, and you can tell right here, this is just a little bit of that window that is showing right there. And of course, that wasn't added until the 1930s, so this was probably just pebbled glass, maybe colored glass. It's hard to tell. So in looking at that, I want to go ahead and describe some of the things regarding the sanctuary and what was going on at that time. The membership was still about 350, but the sanctuary was built to seat 700 people. So that really showed a lot of foresight and faith into what was going to happen. And I think there were probably more than 350 attending at the time. They counted 350 actual members. An article from the Grand Rapids Eagles dated 1885 describes the interior and the dedication service on October 1st when Reverend Sanford Cobb was installed as its pastor. And I said, what would we do without these newspapers that did this? And back then, they were just flowery in how they said things in such detail. The minutes from that era are just who joined, who was dismissed due to bad behavior, who was baptized, and who died. And there was very little said about anything else until probably maybe the 30s. We started getting more detail. Maybe a comment here and there about World War I, but not much. You know, you just didn't get anything out of those particular minutes. So the Eagle said, the auditorium, and as you're looking around, envision this, only you're looking this way now. This is what he's going to be describing, what was on that wall. The auditorium is large and has the pulpit in the east end, and the seats recede towards the rear and the sides in the form of an amphitheater. It's a new arrangement for an audience room for churches and is a decided improvement. The original pews were all curved, just like you would see in an auditorium sometimes. The organ loft is back of the pulpit in an alcove, and you can't even see it. There's so many flowers and things in front of it. 700 persons can easily be seated at the present, and should occasion require, the capacity can be increased 100 or 200. There is no gallery, so meaning no balcony. However, and now you can look up, now the lights are on, but imagine what he calls the dome now. A magnificent glass pendant chandelier is suspended from the dome, and it illuminates the whole edifice. So this chandelier, which was called a Bailey prismatic reflector pendant hung from the ceiling. It had 60 gas jets, and it had all these prisms on it, so that when the gas jets were lit, the light was reflected off the prisms. And I have no idea if it was on a pulley. I don't know how far up. I can't even imagine on a cold winter Sunday night having enough light to see anything in here, but I must have done it. And there probably were some kind of light sconces on the side walls. The thing that I thought was very curious when I started reading all these things, there was never any mention of any stained glass windows in here. And I thought, well, now surely if there would have been stained glass windows in here, they would have mentioned it. In the architectural drawing, all these openings are in there and the different things for the frames. And I think that was already waiting for some donor, or maybe they had been promised and they just didn't have the windows ready by that time. And one of the reasons I came to that conclusion is this big window here and the one that is in the balcony was given by two very prominent people or families in Grand Rapids. This one that faces LaGrave was given by the William Hugart family, and he was president of the Indiana and Grand Rapids Railroad, which actually brought all the supplies up to Mackinac Island to build the Grand Hotel. And the one in the balcony was given in memory of William A. Howard, who prior to coming to Grand Rapids was the head of the Republican Party and served in Congress, and in 1878 he was the governor of the Dakotas territories. And he died in 1880. Now after he died, his wife Jane moved back, became a very active member here again, and she died in the early 1990s. But my feeling was if either one of those windows were in there, they would have made a point of saying this was given by the family of, or the family, but that wasn't in there, so I'm leaving it at that. They went on to say the pulpit is of red oak, and it's made by a company out of Cleveland, and it was a gift from the youth of this church. I actually found, and I have it up here, a book of the original receipts from the different things that were put in here, and the company was the George Fauber Church Furniture Company, something like that. And the receipts are in there for all the pews and for all the different things that they had supplied to the church. Now, the communion table was a gift later, about 2 years later, and I did find that in the session minutes, and it was from the William Hugart family. And in that same year, Jane Howard, the widow of William Howard, gave our baptismal font. So that's from 1887, and she gave that in honor of her grandson, Odin Hugart Howard. And he was baptized, the very first baby baptized in there, July 17th, 1887. And Jane's son married Mr. Hugart's daughter. So these two families combined then, and Mr. Hugart must have decided to do the communion table, and she decided to do the baptismal font, for which we are obviously very happy. Okay. So this is just another slide of the outside, and now we've got those big windows in there, and we think it's about 1888, and one of the reasons we think it is because the streets are still unpaved. When you look at it really close, which you really can't see on this, there's still mud, and the streets around here were not paved until 1890, so somewhere between 1885 and 1890, this picture was taken, and because we were sort of able to put the 1888 on the stained glass windows when we had the people from the stained glass company came in to help us with that. Now between 1911 and 1912, our chancel was moved to face south, and that's what we have now. And just recently this week, and I don't even have the slide up, but I do have the picture here, I was looking at this picture closer, and I realized that everything that was in that other chancel, all that whole, the loft and the wood, everything was recreated up here. So you had an absolute identical thing in there. This vestibule was here already. They must have added that one. You had the organ pipes from the other organ going up, because that glass window wasn't there. And there, I don't know about Tom Macklin could tell us, there's a little staircase there that you go up, and you came to this little flat area, and that's how the choir got up there. And it was probably no deeper than that first set of long pipes. And they had 2 rows of chairs, and boy, you had to be brave to sit up there and sing in there. And then the poor little organist was at the far end facing that wall. So that, I thought all of that was unbelievable, and that was not changed to our present type of situation until 1937. And then that's when the Skinner Aeolian organ was put in, the new pipes, and not the new pipes, but the pipes that went with in 1937, and pretty much the same type of platform. Then all of that came about. So you want to do the next one. So now we're in 1923, and you'll see our little chapel's gone. And I thought that chapel was really lovely, and it must not have been worth saving or whatever. But now we have what we called our new church house, and that was constructed in 1923 by Owen, Ames, and Kimball. And I happened to be at a dinner one night for a fundraiser, and I'm sitting at a table with an architect from there, and I was telling him all of this. And he said, you know, I bet we have the drawings. And I said, gosh, if you could find that. And he called me the following week, and they had the drawings from that new church building. And he made copies, and they're in our archives now, so, which I thought was wonderful. So you'll now see we have a narthex, too. Up until then, we did not have a narthex. You just came in that little tower entrance, walked into the church from there, or you came in the other side from where the chapel was. In 1939, a partition was installed in the narthex because people were complaining how drafty it was in these back pews. So they put the partition in, and when they put that partition in, and I still can't envision how this happened, but that big window in the balcony used to come down as far as this window. So whatever happened to the lower part of that glass is not known, it's gone. And then in the 50s, they put a drop ceiling in the narthex. And lo and behold, in 2008, when we were doing, putting that glass canopy over there, all of a sudden, this panel of glass appears above the drop ceiling that says William A. Howard. And we now knew who this window was given in memory of. And I thought, Howard, boy, that rings a bell. And Jackie Tenhor, who was helping me do all the research, we said, well, Howard's the one that gave the baptismal font. And so we put that together, that Jane had given this window in memory of her husband, and it had been hidden probably since, what did I say, 1950s or 1939, when that partition cut out that lower half of it. All right, let me see where we are now. Next slide. So this is, I'm going to go back a couple years, 1918. This is Reverend William Hess. And he was only 30 years old when he arrived. He was a graduate, 1912 graduate of Princeton, and would remain until 1925. And I mention him mainly because he was responsible for bringing the General Assembly to Grand Rapids in 1924, at a time when only 1% of the population here was Presbyterian. But this guy was really sharp. He went to the General Assembly in 1923 in Indianapolis, and he went prepared with commitments from local hotels for 1,000 rooms to house the delegates. Who knew that Grand Rapids in 1923 had 1,000 rooms, but they did. And he also had commitments from the local churches, not only just Presbyterian, but other denominations, to house different meetings, because there were 957 delegates that needed space to have all these meetings, and obviously we couldn't hold them all. So this brings up a little quick story in that this is a walking stick, and it's actually was made in 1924, so it's almost 100 years old. This was made by the youth of Westminster. Now I suspect they got the canes from one of the local furniture companies, made them, and then the kids all sanded them down, varnished them, or whatever. And on the end of the cane is a little symbol made out of, not ceramic, but metal, and it says 1936 Assembly Presbyterian Church, Grand Rapids, 1924. So all 957 delegates got this. And one of our wonderful members, John Wagner, who died many years ago, passed us on to Phil Hertel. And Phil Hertel, many years ago, said, "Do you want this?" I said, "Yes." So we've got it. We've got it. And then this is just a jewel. This is a whole book of dozens and dozens of newspaper articles from this 1-week event that happened here. And I don't even know where I found it, but I asked Steve Marshall one day, I said, "Would you read through these and do a summary?" So he did that for me maybe 10 years ago. And then we just would put it out, but it was in the original old Alvin, and people couldn't look at it or anything. So a couple months ago, I decided to get all of these in this acid-free type of binder. And then I decided to sit down and read the whole thing. And lo and behold, here was the story of this. And it just went on, and how the Pullman cars were added to the trains to bring the delegates in, and where they came from, and who were the dignitaries, and who did this and that, and this huge baseball game that the delegates marched up Fulton to East Grand Rapids baseball field right by Reed's Lake. And I can't even imagine that. And Alma College played Worcester, and I think Alma won. I'd have to look at that again. But it was like the event of the week. Everybody was talking about it, so it was just amazing. So these lovely ladies, I first encountered on our wall out there, which I had nothing to do with, and I thought, oh, they must be Westminster women, because that's our doors, and so I labeled it Westminster Women 1920s. So I'm looking through this book, and who are there but the ladies with all their names? And they were Presbyterian women, and they were from the different Presbyterian churches in Grand Rapids at that time. And this book tells about different meetings they went through, mainly with the Women's Missionary Society or whatever. And I just thought, my gosh, you know, this is amazing. So I was able to get their names and all of that. But also in reading this, I found out their main purpose was to try to convince the delegates to allow them to have a vote. And their argument was that they raised huge amounts of money each year by selling soap, wax paper, that was a big thing, and other items, and held multiple dinner and lunch fundraisers, and yet they were required to hand over the money to the men who decided how it would be spent. So the men listened to it, and in true Presbyterian fashion, after they pleaded their request, the delegates decided a committee should be formed. And the decision delayed until the next convention in 1925. And I thought their smiles were rather forced, especially the lady on the top second from the right. She doesn't look too happy. I think it was 1930 when the Presbyterian Church finally allowed women to be ordained, and in order to be a delegate, you had to be in an ordained position. So I have no idea when they actually ordained, had ordained delegates coming to that. Okay, the next one. So this is Reverend Downey. In 1934, he arrived along with his family, Reverend Edward Downey. He was 32 years old. He would remain until 1938, and Reverend Downey received his theological degree from Louisville Presbyterian Seminary in 1930. Go to the next one. So this is the whole Downey family, kind of a typical Presbyterian minister's family. But I put this up here because I had the pleasure of meeting Earl, one of the twins, and you'll see there's Earl on the left and Billy on the right. I don't know how many years ago, but I asked him to give me a few stories about their time here at the church, and I'll just tell you two short ones. Earl was saying that his father was very strict with them in terms of their behavior in church, of course. And when their mother had to work in the nursery or couldn't be there, they were absolutely not allowed to talk to each other. They had to be perfect examples. Well, this one Sunday, Earl said he and Billy just couldn't stop giggling, and they were fidgeting. And his father was in the middle of the sermon. He came right out of the pulpit, down to the pew, grabbed one, put him with one family, grabbed the other, put him with the other family, and he went up and he continued the sermon. And of course, Earl said, we never forgot that, and we were always good after that. And then the other one, which I think is really funny, Earl and Billy were out playing football on a Sunday afternoon on the old Calvin College campus on Franklin. And along during a wonderful afternoon walk came a Calvin professor, and he stopped and he said, young men, do you know it's a sin to play ball on a Sunday? And Earl said, we said, no, sir, we didn't know it was a sin. And he said, who is your father? And he said, well, our father's the Reverend Edward Downey. And then this professor said, and what church is he with? And Earl said, he's with Westminster Presbyterian. And then Earl said, at that point, the professor threw up his arms, walked away, and said, well, that explains it. So I think we had a little reputation back then already. So, of course, this is Camp Henry. And this picture was taken in 1937. And Reverend Downey was responsible for establishing Camp Henry and getting the initial funding from a Westminster member, Henry Idema, for those 200 first acres that we had. And Reverend Downey had a passion for offering a place for Christian camping experiences, not only for youth, Westminster youth, but for kids who could not afford to go to camp. And of course, that continues today, and this camp is huge and tremendously successful. And this began the first of our 3 core missions. So now we're in the 70s, actually the 60s and 70s, and this is Reverend John Lester. He was with us from 1967 to 1973. He was a graduate of Yale Divinity School in 1948 while he was in the Navy, and then when he got out, he got his Master's of Divinity at Pittsburgh Theological Seminary in 1960. In the late 60s, our focus on missions, which was mainly overseas at that time, changed to our surrounding neighborhood when Reverend Don Lester arrived. And he was with us, as I said, until 1973. His goal was for Westminster to broaden our local outreach. And this is when our neighborhood became the Hartside area. We began to become involved in many neighborhood programs. Dwelling Place began, affordable housing, after-school tutoring programs were expanded with other downtown churches, and new business startup programs. When Reverend Lester moved on in 1973, he had proposed 13 different outreach programs for our session to consider. And out of this eventually grew our next core mission, the Westminster Child Development Center. And that was in 1969. The photo isn't from 1969, but the pastors who were called after Dr. Lester challenges us even more to be involved in our community. And this eventually led to the opening of our 3rd core mission, the food pantry, and that was in 1990. Okay. So this is us today. And as our doors opened wider with each new pastor, and we developed our theme of absolutely everyone is welcomed at Westminster. And this is simply because we follow Christ's teachings. Some programs were tried and were successful, some failed, but we always kept evolving. And we always kept looking for new ways to help partner with our neighbors and to be an inclusive community. So we're still here. Over the years, there were 3 different times when we discussed moving to different locations, but God has called us to be in this place. We're still a faith-filled community. We survived a lot of turbulent times, the Civil War, the Spanish-American War, World War I and II, and so on. The pandemic of 1918, when we closed our doors for 90 days, and the only way of communicating was to mail out the pastor's sermon once a week. We survived the crash of 1929, the Great Depression, on, and we're still here. And then in 2020, the pandemic arrived worldwide, and our doors were shuttered for 455 days. But technology gave us what? The gift of communicating with each other every day, and we're still here. We're a very diverse congregation, most not raised Presbyterian, some conservative, some liberal, some in between, and we've learned to listen to each other, and somehow we've learned to survive controversies when they come up. We have faith that God still wants us here at 47 Jefferson, and that's why our members continue to say yes when asked to serve on committees or in leadership roles or to give of their tithes and offerings. Our forebears set the example for us, and we believe in passing this forward too. We believe that in 100 years from now, we'll still be here and we'll still be following Christ's teachings that absolutely everyone is welcome. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. Any questions for Carolyn? Okay, I'm going to hand the mic back to you.
I have a friend who has been attending Eastminster, which is closing in 2 weeks, but she said that Eastminster was like a church plant or somehow connected with Westminster that I didn't know.
Data that. We actually were involved in the planting of several different churches over the history, some way back in the early, but Eastminster was. And just like First Press, we sent over, I don't know how many different members from here to be a part of that church, and eventually our associate pastor, Reverend Ed Brigham, I believe his name was their first pastor. So it's definitely, yeah.
And we had to have the street dug up because of plumbing,
Yeah.
or the gas line, or no, the water line.
Anyway.
Yeah. And when they dug up the street, first came the asphalt, next came the clay brick, and then there was another layer of wood brick.
Cobbles, yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And I think that's what was here, eventually the first thing that came before the brick was
Yeah.
the cobbles made out of wood.
Just why was the front turned to the side? Because when I look
Right.
at it,
Yeah.
that looks not that different.
No.
What was
Well, the very first articles in the Grand Rapids Herald talked about this amazing, perfect acoustics. 1 year later, there's an article that the church was vacated for X amount of months while they fixed the acoustic problems. And they talked about having to put, the ceiling and the walls were lined with canvas. And in one of the pictures here, you'll see that. And then I never heard another thing. I couldn't find anything about the acoustics. And so then the turn of the century, around 1911, what I read was they turned this because of the acoustics. Now, at that time in 1911 is when they electrified this building. So I'm wondering maybe, I don't know anything about when any kind of microphone started. I don't know, maybe they had a better way of talking then, but never saw another thing about that after that.
Spiral book on the history that you gave me.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
It also mentioned something about they got more seating this way than the other way.
Yeah, and because I questioned that number, and then when the delegates came, they said we could seat 1,000 people. And that was in 1923. So then I thought, well, obviously when they changed, they must have been able to get more pews in, and then they had added the balcony. So I think that was another. And when we joined in 81, and those original pews were here until I think the mid-80s, and many of you that are here will remember that, you'd start down an aisle and dead end into the back of the pews, because there was no center aisle. They couldn't make them fit. And those were one of our controversies that we all lived through. And we got through it. It was $50,000 to put the new pews in versus $100,000 to renovate the old ones, and with no guarantee that they wouldn't be all loose and falling apart within a year. So, Tom.
Carolyn, I've always marveled at our sanctuary and the beams in here.
Yeah.
And I noticed a couple months ago when I was over at St. Mark's their arched wooden beams are very similar to the ones here, and they're an Owen Ames Kimball sanctuary.
Oh,
Oh, so is it Owen Ames Kimball that did our sanctuary also?
I don't know. I'd have to try to see if I could find that out. The architect was this D.S. Hopkins. He's the one that designed the whole thing. I'm not sure if in that book we have receipts from the people. I know Owen Ames was involved in many of our different, and it wouldn't surprise me because they were around.
I also wonder if our newer members wonder what all these tie rods are for in the building.
That's holding us together. Anybody from that particular capital campaign? Is that what those tie rods are for? Yeah, we did a lot over the, yeah.
And when we arrived, there were some men going up to put tarp on the chapel, the
Yeah,
current chapel.
yeah,
So I'm
yeah.
guessing that maybe the
As you
rain
know, there's
caused
a
a leak.
constant in these old buildings, constant. Now, a few years ago, we put a new slate roof on this roof.
Okay, one last question from Ann, and then I'm sure Carolyn will stay afterwards and answer individual questions up front.
It's not a question, it's a statement. I always had a church pew in my house
yeah.
when Westminster changed over.
Yeah, that's right. People were allowed to take the old pews or buy them, however, and a lot of the congregation did that.
Okay, as we close, I have a couple of announcements, and then if you have a question for Carolyn, I'm
Yep,
sure you
and
can
I got
come
a lot
up
of
and look
stuff up here you
around.
can look at.
First of all, we always do birthdays, and when I looked, I found November birthdays are Ann Barbara has a November birthday, and Tom Cormos has a November birthday. Anybody else have a November birthday? All right, well, let's sing happy birthday to them. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Ann and Tom. Happy birthday to you. Also, I want to invite you to next month's program, which is going to be a Christmas program developed and designed by Diane Helly and a friend of hers. And she hasn't given me a title yet, but it will be a Christmas program. Also, there are bags at the desk, and you can take one now or Sunday for the Thanksgiving in gathering for the food pantry. There's a list of items on there that you can purchase, or you can purchase and fill the bag with, or anything else that you have. I would say from past experience, so make sure you take the fresh date, because a lot of times these in-gatherings are things we've had in our pantry for a long time, and the fresh dates are long past, even on the canned goods. So if you wouldn't eat it, please don't put it in the bag for somebody else. And then, in closing, I would like us to do a song prayer. So I need some help passing these back. Maybe Carolyn can pass them. I'll keep one for me. This is a little camp kind of song. Maybe some of you know it. Thank you for giving me the morning. And we'll close with that as our prayer. And then again, Carolyn will be up front if you have any questions, and I'll take any errant name tags that made it past Maureen in the dining room. So, yes, Tom.
Well, those will be passed out for any of you interested. The Interfaith Thanksgiving service is on November the 20th at 7 p.m. over at Fountain Street Church. It's always a very interesting service, and it is sponsored by our Interfaith.
By Kaufman Interfaith Institute and a variety of congregations of different faiths represented. And it is a unique experience because Thanksgiving is a national holiday, not a Christian holiday. And so that is why we do that, is because it's a time that we can all express gratitude together, no matter what our faith tradition. This little song is something that I learned at camp, and when it just came to me when I was thinking about this season of gratitude. And this is, it's going to be low because that's what you get when an alto leads you in singing. So let's sing this together as our closing. Thank you for giving me the morning. Thank you for every day that's new. Thank you that I can know my worries can be cast on you. Thank you for all my friends and brothers. Thank you for all the men that live. Thank you for even greatest enemies I can forgive. Thank you for many little sorrows. Thank you for every kindly word. Thank you for everywhere your guidance reaches every land. Thank you, I see your word has meaning. Thank you, I know your spirit here. Thank you, because you love all people, those both far and near. Thank you, O Lord, you spoke unto us. Thank you that for our words you care. Thank you, O Lord, you came among us, bread and wine to share. Thank you, O Lord, your love is boundless. Thank you that I am full of you. Thank you, you make me feel so glad and thankful as I do. Have a good rest of the week.